So the big picture thing that we're going to study in Unit 3 is kind of like how the stuff we learned in Unit 1 relates to the stuff we learned in Unit 2, and how, designing a class can be mixed with creation of objects in order to write real programs. And one of the labs we're going to do is this. We're going to write a little program that kind of simulates two servers where somebody's trying to log into one server and maybe there's a bad guy listening, so we're going to encrypt our login information so that when that login is transmitted, via the internet or over a network of some kind, bad guys can't figure out our login information. In order to do that, you're going to write three classes that are like this, okay? You're going to write a class called login attempt, a class called encryptor, and a class called login processor. And this diagram here is supposed to kind of show you how classes use other classes, so you can get an idea of where the dependencies are. Let's go back and just talk about what you're going to be coding. So for example, in the login attempt class, this basically is just an abstraction of the idea that anytime you log in, it is basically two strings combined together. You're going to have a username string and a password string. And so if we go into the login attempt, I'm actually just going to show you the code. It really is. It's just all it is a username and a password, right? But the objects of this class will kind of represent a person's attempt to log in somewhere. And it just combines these two strings into one unit. So it's simply an object that kind of represents two strings combined. And we simply have get methods. Notice that login attempt objects are immutable, right? There's no set methods in here. So once you create a login attempt object, it's impossible to change the username or the password. So that's just a design. So a login attempt is like a utility class. It just kind of represents objects, but it doesn't do a whole lot. And that's why you see all these arrows pointing at it, but it's not pointing to anything else because it doesn't use anything complicated. It just uses the string class. Another class you're going to make is this thing that we're going to call an encryptor, and its job is to kind of create objects, which we're going to call encryptor objects, and these objects encrypt strings for us. So it actually doesn't have any instance variables at all because we're going to use a really unsophisticated encryption method. We're really just going to scramble the letters around. But it has two methods. It has an encrypt method and a decrypt method. And so when you pass a string into the encryptor object and call its encrypt method, it will scramble the letters up in a way that you'll see later. And similarly, if you pass in a scrambled string into the decrypt method, it will unscramble them and return them. So the encryptor's only job is to encrypt strings using a particular pattern and to decrypt strings in a particular pattern, and that is its only job. So it also is a very independent class. It doesn't need any other classes in order to do its job. That's why we don't see it pointing to anything else. Now if we look at the login processor class, this is another class that you're going to write in this lab. It points to encryptor and it points to login attempt, and that's all. Now that's going to mean it depends upon, or it uses encryptor objects and it uses login attempt objects. And that kind of makes sense. The idea that the login processor is supposed to kind of represent the part of the server that processes login attempts, and that's all its job is. So you'll see that the server class, and just think of this as like a simulation of a web server or some other kind of server that just kind of manages lots of users trying to log in and log out. It is going to have in it a little component, and that component manages all of the login processing. So the server is able to kind of like delegate all login processing to this object or objects of this class. So if we look inside the login processor object, we see that it has an encryptor as an instance variable. So it kind of like holds on to this encryptor object as one of its attributes. I always think of this as kind of like the Enigma boxes that those World War II submarines would carry around with them, that they use to encrypt things for them. So it's just like its little utility belt that it uses to encrypt strings for it. And then it has this one private method that just kind of helps it get some jobs done internally, which is just it prepares a login attempt object for encryption, which just means it's going to take the username and the password from the login attempt object and assemble it in a particular way that makes it easier to encrypt. Then this method, well, this is the public method that will be called from outside the class. The login attempt object comes in here. It calls the prepare for encryption method, which assembles the username and the password, and then this will encrypt that object and send it off. And then likewise there is a receive and decrypt transmission method, which does kind of the opposite of this other method. It receives a string, which we receive as a transmission. This transmission will be encrypted, so it will look very mysterious. This method will use the encryptor object to decrypt this transmission and return a corresponding login attempt object, which will be fully decrypted. So again, this login processor class kind of simulates like a little machine that simply prepares login attempts. And again, a login attempts is just a username and a password. It prepares login attempts to be sent out, and it takes transmissions in, scrambled, encrypted transmissions in, decrypts them, and then generates new login attempt objects based on the decoded transmission. So this is the idea, and again, the big picture here is to understand that what we have are 3 different classes here. You're going to code all 3 of these. They're relatively independent. In other words, login attempt doesn't use any other classes other than string. Encryptor doesn't use any other classes other than string. The login processor uses login attempt objects and encryptor objects, and therefore we have some objects that are being taught to interact with each other in a meaningful way. We coded these more complicated ones for you, but again, if we looked inside the server class, you would see it has references to a login processor and to login attempts. It even, so a server has a login processor as an instance variable. And if I were to scroll down somewhere in here, we would find here, there's a login attempt. So the receive login transmission method actually creates a login attempt object inside this code. So this is an introduction into object-oriented programming. These classes depend on one another, therefore objects of these classes can interact with one another in these predefined ways, and each class has a very, very specific role that it performs for the program. Alright, we can talk more in class, but this is the idea of object-oriented programming and how we're going to refer to it in this unit. And do notice that this is a combination of what we learned in Unit 1, where we were creating objects, and Unit 2, when we were designing classes.